We're here in Boise, Idaho. We're on the top of Table Rock, on the east end of Boise, Idaho. From here you get a great view of the city of trees, Boise. By the way, there's no Z in Boise. Boise's a city of about 250,000 people. Table Rock is kind of Boise's inspiration point. You have to wonder how many of the 250,000 people were conceived up here. You know what else you get a great view of up here? The yard and the prison below. Idaho used to hang its condemned in the center of the yard, and many of the good citizens of Boise and the surrounding area would bring a picnic, sit out on Table Rock or some of the other hills around the area, and watch the proceedings. Well, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you made it. I'm Mark Haggard. I'm a history teacher gone rogue, and we're on a field trip to the Old Idaho State Penitentiary. Oh, what? You made it? God, I thought you got abducted by aliens along the way. Hey, remember when we went to the planetarium with Mr. Wright's class? We were in that round room, and I told you to go stand in the corner? That was an entertaining 4 hours. Sharp as a marble. The first Idaho State Penitentiary was commissioned in 1872. Over its 101-year history, it has housed 13,000 inmates. At its height, it housed 600 individual inmates. Over its years, the pen saw 110 deaths. 10 of them were by execution. Riots over living conditions sprang up in the 1950s and again in the early 1970s, leading the state of Idaho to build a new corrections facility south of the city. This penitentiary closed down in 1973, but the pen has left an interesting history, though. These are the community showers here at the old State Penitentiary. When I was going through my master's work at Boise State, one of my classmates was a docent here at the old Idaho State Penitentiary. One of the Ghostbuster shows on Travel Channel found out that this was one of the most psychically charged places and paranormally charged places in the world, and they brought a TV crew in here to film some of this stuff. They asked her about some of the places. When she was talking about the shower, she was talking about this guy that, in her words, was gang raped to death inside the showers. So they spent a bunch of time focusing on that. And her 15 minutes of fame for her life is the use of the words gang raped to death for 15 or 20 times during an episode of Ghostbusters. You good? So this was Siberia. This is not quite arm's length. It's a little bit of height here, but this was solitary confinement. Built in 1926. So somebody's solitary confinement would be from as short as 1 day to, I've heard stories of people being here for a year. But imagine what that does to the mind. At least there's some daylight coming in from this hole in the top, but not much else. Siberia. This building, this was one of the cells in the cooler, which was built in 1923. This was solitary confinement. Originally it was supposed to be for one person at a time, but as inmates became more and more rambunctious, you ended up having 2 or 3 or even up to 5 people being held in here at a time. No lights. You got one source of air coming through the top, and not much else. If you had to be here for a while, it was going to be a long while. This is the inside of 2 house. Now, my son, Caleb, who's a corrections officer at the modern day Idaho Corrections Facility, he was noticing that they used flat iron here rather than using the round iron. Notice these aren't the bars that you can take your coffee cup and drag across and make a bunch of noise. That's not the reason for it. This obviously is a cost-saving matter. Still just as efficient though, and the rooms are still just as small. Two House was the home of some of the Idaho State Penitentiary's youngest inmates. In 1885, James Oscar Baker was brought into the penitentiary, recently convicted of manslaughter. He was pardoned after less than a year. He was 10 years old.
Going up there.
Over its history, the penitentiary housed 215 women. The most famous was Lyda Southard, known as Lady Bluebeard, and likely one of America's first female serial killers. She was convicted in 1921 of the murder of her fourth husband, Ed Moyer, in Twin Falls. An investigation soon linked her to the untimely deaths of her three previous husbands, a brother-in-law, and her own daughter, all in order to collect upon their life insurance. All of them developed what people thought was food poisoning. It turns out that Lyda was adept at boiling the arsenic out of the flypaper, then cooking the arsenic into dinner. It is suggested that the deaths of her 6 victims netted her $30,000, the equivalent of $750,000 today. While in the Idaho State Pen, she befriended a male inmate whose time was almost up. Upon his release, she asked him to set up a rose trellis near the wall and to be prepared with a getaway car. The two were long gone before she was discovered missing the next morning. 15 months later, she was discovered in Topeka, Kansas, and returned to the Idaho State Pen, to the very cell from which she had escaped. She was given a pardon in 1943 and then married again. This husband, surprise, disappeared as well. Lyda Southard continually maintained her innocence, up to her death in 1958 at the age of 65. Her body was reportedly devoid of hair when it was sent to Twin Falls for burial, a side effect of prolonged exposure to arsenic. In 1935, after years of abuse at the hands of her husband, Mildred Hook filed for divorce in Tacoma, Washington. Jilted, Douglas VanVlack kidnapped his ex-wife and planned to take her to Mexico. While traveling through Oregon, he had a change of plan and turned east into Idaho. When he was pulled over by 2 Idaho State troopers near Buell, he shot and killed both men. He later killed his ex-wife, first fracturing her skull with the butt of his pistol and then shooting her. He buried her body in a culvert underneath railroad tracks south of Twin Falls. A jury convicted Douglas VanVlack of murdering his ex-wife and the 2 police officers. In 1937, the day of his execution, his parents came to visit him. His mother whispered something in his ear. Then he escaped from his cell and climbed up into the rafters 30 feet above the cell block. After hanging out for 30 minutes, he yelled, "I have the right to choose the way I die." And boy, did he. He then did a Peter Pan, diving from the rafters to the concrete floor below. So this is maximum security. 1 bed, 1 sink, 1 toilet in the back, 0 privacy. Speaking of 0 privacy, if you need to take a shower, yeah, 0 privacy. The hanging room here at the Old Idaho State Penitentiary was only used once. In 1956, Raymond Snowden was convicted of the murder of a woman named Cora Dean. he had met Corradine in Garden City, and after a date gone wrong, Raymond Snowden stabbed her 30 times. When the time came for his execution, the trap door was let go, and he went down halfway between the first and second floor. The fall, unfortunately, didn't break his neck, and he sat there strangling for 15 minutes before he died. The most famous prisoner in the Old Idaho State Penitentiary was Harry Orchard. After admitting to the 1905 assassination of former Governor Frank Steunenberger, he decided to turn state's evidence on other members of a larger plot. His sentence was commuted to life in prison, and his testimony set up what becomes known as the trial of the century. More on that in part 2 of our field trip to Boise, Idaho. Hey, thanks for coming along on our field trip. I want to thank my son Caleb for being an advisor for me. Comment, like, and subscribe if you would. I hope you had fun. I sure did, but I won't quit my day job. I'm Mark Haggard. I'm a history teacher gone rogue, and this has been Field Trip. Back on the bus. Take your time, guys.